Good morning. Thanks for joining us again today for another weekly webinar that we've been putting on. This is webinar number 9. So we've covered a lot of topics in the last few weeks, and we'll cover a lot more in the weeks ahead. And as you see on the screen if you're seeing it, a reminder that please remember to mute your microphone and post questions in the chat box as we go through. If something comes up that you want to ask a question about, please pose it there, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Also today, I want to thank Bauer Funeral Home for being our webinar sponsor today. Bauer is a long-time business in Effingham County. They have been in business since 1932. They have locations here in Effingham on Evergreen Avenue and also in Teutopolis, just along Route 4. So we thank Bauer Funeral Home for supporting the webinar today. So as we go into introducing our speakers, I'd say that we've all learned a lot about ourselves and our businesses in the past couple of months. We've reevaluated a lot of things and adjusted our businesses to manage new restrictions and how we operate. Today we welcome Kay and Roy Dent of Dent Law Offices to provide some ideas and recommendations on taking a deeper look at our business operations. Kay Dent attended law school with plans to practice disability law. She worked her way through college at the University of Illinois, assisting students with disabilities, and graduated from Hofstra University School of Law in 1996. She initially worked with the nonprofit providing legal services exclusively to persons with disabilities. After years of practice as both a state's attorney and public offender, she joined her husband Roy Dent in Dent Law Offices, where she provides an array of elder law and estate planning services. Kay is a member of the Illinois chapter of Elder Council and the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. She's also a member of the local bar association and serves as treasurer of the Children's Advocacy Center of Illinois. Kay also serves on the Southeastern Illinois Community Foundation Advisory Board for Effingham County and chairs the Fifth Circuit Pro Bono Committee of the Public Interest Law Initiative. Roy Dent grew up in the Los Angeles area and out of high school to care for his mother. When a former teacher connected him to a program that allowed him to finish high school, he actually graduated ahead of his fellow students. He then graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's degree in history and magna cum laude with a master's degree in history. Observing companies that he worked with file for bankruptcy, Roy discovered a calling to focus on bankruptcy law and finds it a lifesaver for many people. Roy serves on the board of directors for the Effingham Performance Center and also on the Illinois State Bar Association Standing Committee for Continuing Legal Education. Roy and Kay are both members of Effingham Noon Rotary. So welcome, Kay and Roy. We thank you for joining us today, and take it away.
Thanks for having us, Norma.
Yes. Thank you, Norma.
I think, this is a big topic to talk about, so it's going to be kind of broad, but the thing that I've realized through all of this is that slow and steady wins the race. It seems like, I know in our world, it seems like things are moving much slower, where people used to reasonably expect things to be done yesterday. People are much more patient. The courts, weren't really that open for a while. They're just kind of starting to open up. And so things were getting delayed and nobody was generally throwing a big of a fit about it. We were very fortunate because we had already gone online some time ago, in fact, years ago. So we already had a lot of the infrastructure in place to deal with things online. But even then it was a learning curve because not all of our clients had that capability or comfort with it. So we had to slow down to kind of meet their needs and let some of them catch up with us. But I'm gonna hand it over to Roy to talk a little bit about the business structures and how important those are, and why it's a good time that things are slow to step back and see if you have the right business structure. If you don't have a business structure, if you're a DBA, a sole proprietor, would it benefit you to have a business structure? And have you been keeping your records up to date? So I'll let Roy chat about that a little bit.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, this is a great opportunity for many people to slow down, and we've been kind of forced to shut down in some respects, to think about how are we doing business and to even reassess our businesses. And it's a great opportunity for a lot of people to ask, well, how are you doing business? For instance, some people are sole proprietors, which is a really good way to do it, where essentially you're either doing business under your name or you've created a trade name and you've gone through the formalities of putting the notice of using an assumed name in the newspaper and gone to the county clerk and paid your fee. And there's nothing wrong with that. There may be some negative tax consequences of that because you may not be able to deduct all of your business expenses as a sole proprietor. And there may be some liability issues for you, but that is one way to do it. Another way to do it is through a partnership. And a partnership is two or more people entered into business with the goal of, well, making a profit. And a partnership is, it's a very simple format. You do not even need a written agreement for it. It's just two people say, let's say we're gonna go mow lawns together.
But this is where I step in and say not having a written agreement is a really bad idea.
Oh, yes.
We have both seen some really bad things happen to businesses without very clear written agreements. So again, I think that this is a good time if you have some extra time because we're not quite moving at the same pace. Take a step back and see if you really have all the documentation and all the agreements that you need to have a stable business. One of the things that people forget is that it's all fun and games until something happens.
Yep.
And if the time comes, for instance, if Roy and I weren't married, if the time came and I said, I'm going to retire out of this partnership, if we did not have an agreement already in place about what the rules are for the retiring partner and how things are going to be handled, it could end in a very ugly way. And we've seen that play out.
Well, and there's also just tort liability consequences. For instance, if you're doing business as a partnership, you are responsible for the tortious acts of your business partner. And that could be a very disturbing thing. While if you are doing business as a corporation, you have a shield in many respects from liability of your employees and business partners. And in many respects, your liability as a shareholder is limited to your capital investment in the company if you've done everything correctly. And also, there's a great thing called limited liability companies, which give you, in many respects, the same protection as a corporation, but maybe even greater protection against people trying to come at you individually or trying to pierce the company veil. So it's a great opportunity for people to take a step back during this time and really reassess how are they doing business. And also, it wouldn't hurt to get a checkup and make sure if you are doing business as a corporation or if you're doing business as an LLC or a limited partnership, are you doing business correctly? Have you maintained, and we'll get in a minute, all the company formalities or corporate formalities?
But I want to point out that one of the things that I stress to folks all the time is tax, because I know that people are very concerned about that. Tax is money. When I'm helping somebody set up a business, I always want to talk to their CPA. And it's not uncommon for me to have people come to me wanting to start a new business, maybe haven't had a business before, and they don't even have a relationship with a CPA. I'm going to try to match them up with someone and make sure that we're working as a team, because I'm not a CPA. I know enough about tax to be hopefully helpful and not dangerous, but I'm not going to act as a CPA. I'm going to talk to the CPA about the options and see how we best save the client money while also protecting them. In a lot of cases, something like an S corporation or an LLC can fit the bill. We've seen clients save tens of thousands of dollars in taxes by incorporating rather than just being a DBA or sole proprietor.
Yeah, no, and really, and you know, the horrible trial lawyer, I'm always nervous and looking around corners for the next bad thing to happen. I'm always looking at the tort liability too, and sometimes that feeds into whether or not, a good talk for another time, is asset protection. Because after you've done all of this, it still may not be enough. And if you're in a high risk, highly litigious industry, it's important to have a corporate structure to shield you from liability, but also that may not be enough for you. And you may need to engage in asset protection measures to protect you from, well, losing everything you worked so hard for. But one of the things I mentioned earlier is keeping the right paperwork. And for instance, if you are running a corporation, are you paying your franchise tax every year to the Secretary of State? Are you holding an annual meeting for shareholders? Are you holding an annual or quarterly meeting for the directors? Do you have directors? Do you have officers? Do the officers have any type of meeting? But also, do you keep records of these meetings? Because these can all be very important issues, because the idea is the corporation is its own entity. You know, it's essentially a person under the law. So it has its own name. It has its birth certificate called an Articles of Incorporation. And, you know, the idea is that you need to keep those formalities to protect that corporate or company entity, because if you fail to take those steps, somebody suing you could pierce that corporate veil and go directly after the shareholders. So the tort liability that you're hoping to keep by having a corporate entity could be lost. So for instance, if you have a company and you have a delivery driver, and the delivery driver is negligent and accidentally causes an accident that goes beyond the insurance coverage, which could happen. It's very easy these days. And a very savvy trial lawyer, the next step they're going to look at is, do the owners of the company have any assets? Do they have houses I can put liens on? Do they have paid for vehicles we can seize? So one of the things they would look for in discovery, and this is a part of the litigation process, is a copy of your books and records. Did you hold meetings? Did you commingle assets? Did you pay your cable bill out of your corporate checking account rather than writing yourself a check and then paying your household expenses? Because if you fail to keep that separation, that true line of distinction between where you end and the company begins, you could find yourself in a position where you are being individually sued for a liability of your corporation. And it's important for people that have a corporation or an LLC to take those steps to really get a checkup from somebody who does this, to give them an opinion as to what steps they could do better, that in that unfortunate event, they have more protection. And I think that's where I attack most of this from, is a tort liability perspective than necessarily a tax liability.
And I'll just mention that in our practice, the way things go when we're involved in businesses, generally I'm the one who's setting up the business and he's the one who's dealing with that end of things. So we kind of handle just different aspects of it and look at different things. But again, I'm always really concerned about tax and about the formalities. I've actually had more than once somebody come to me not having done their corporate books in years. In one case, it had been at least a couple of decades, if not 3. And that's a big undertaking to go back and see what has the company done and memorialize all of that. The corporate records are a huge deal if something happens. They're one of those things that, you don't know what you've got until it's gone. So again, while things are kind of slowed down, it's a really good time to meet with your attorney and CPA and have a business checkup, have a real thorough workover, and make sure that your records are up to date and will protect you if something happens. I think the best practice going forward is always to keep your records up to date as things happen. You need to have someone in your business who is the point person on that. You need to have a system in place. A lot of people just use their attorney to keep their records up to date, and they may do that once a year. But some folks take care of it themselves. If you do, I would suggest that the best practice is not to try to do it once a year, but just make it part of a system that if we're buying another fleet truck, we're going to document that, you know, the board voted on this, or the president, whoever, however the decisions are made, which is going to be determined by your bylaws or operating agreement, that the decision was made properly by the right people, and that the, you know, you want to make sure that the company's not insolvent when you're doing things, talking with the CPA and making sure that everything's kosher. And I just, again, I think that if you're doing it yourself, the best practice is just to take care of it right when you're making the purchase or making the change, so that things don't get lost in the shuffle or don't get delayed. There is some controversy about the timing of these. You know, I think the minority of people say, oh, you can't go back and backdate things. If things were done properly off paper, my opinion is that you can backdate and simply memorialize that, yes, this was done and it was done properly at the time, and we're signing off on it. I don't think that there's an issue with that, because again, you're, the action isn't taken because someone signs a piece of paper. The action is taken because someone makes a decision, even in their head or orally during a meeting. But it does need to be memorialized. And of course, the way to not let that get away from you is to do it as soon as possible after the decision. But you've got to do things in accordance with your bylaws and operating agreement. I've seen companies try to operate without those formalities, or with really boilerplate stuff that doesn't apply to them. I've seen people, you know, you pull stuff off the internet, and the internet has a lot of great resources, but the internet doesn't talk to you. The internet doesn't counsel you. That's why you need attorneys and CPAs and financial advisors.
Well, you've even seen them where they didn't even have an operating agreement. And
Yeah.
you can not have an operating agreement for an LLC or bylaws, because the state has been nice enough, and we know how competent the state of Illinois is, that the state, I'm sorry, cringe time. The state of Illinois has given you your operating agreement or your bylaws, and it's called either the Business Corporations Act or the LLC Act. But the problem is that may not fit everything. And you may have unique situations, such as, how do you deal with disputes of partners? Do you have a dispute resolution section? And these are things that a lot of those online legal forms companies do not offer as part of the boilerplate. But it's important for the owners of a business to have some type of formality, so there's clarity for the business owners of, oh, how do we handle a situation when this happens? Or how do we deal with a business dispute or a winding down? Let's say we're going to, somebody wants to be cashed out. What is the procedure for valuing the company? So that's why it's really important to meet with a professional to have these things put in there. And I don't think it's too late. If, let's say you have a bare bones one, would you think, Kay, that you can go to an attorney and have an amended operating report or changes done if everybody agrees?
I think it's almost never too late, as long as everyone's competent, is informed, and the playing field is relatively level. You know, you never want somebody entering into a contract necessarily under duress or with undue influence. But if people are just sitting there, like after having some time to slow down during COVID and hearing people talk about it and say, well, shoot, we should get some documentation done, and there is a meeting of the minds, yeah, there's no problem in doing that. So again, this is the time, while a lot of people, and I would say almost the majority of people, have some extra time on their hands, because the world hasn't stopped spinning, but it sure has slowed down. Look and make sure that you have all these things in in order. Like Roy mentioned, the buy-sell agreement should be part of the operating agreement. That's the one where what happens if somebody gets out. If you're in an LLC with two of your brothers and you own a farm, farm LLCs are very common. It's a great way to have that operation. But again, you've got to have all of the correct documentation in place and have the details correct for your situation. Not every LLC is going to have exactly the same rules because it's not going to have exactly the same people in it, exactly the same type of business, and exactly the same goals. But the buy-sell agreement is really important because what if this farm you own with your two brothers, one of your brothers passes away? What are we going to do then? Does his widow or does one of his children or more of his children become a member of the LLC? If they do they have voting rights? If so, what voting rights do they have? And if the idea is, well, we would just buy her out, do you have the cash to buy her out? Or should the LLC be purchasing insurance or the other members having, cross insurance so that they can buy each other out? That's a very common mechanism to use, is the life insurance. But you've got to sit down and think about it and think about how it would work and actually get it in place and in writing. So I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding, and I think that the heart of the entrepreneur sometimes overrides the head, and entrepreneurs are doing, they're largely doing things that they're very passionate about, and they're passionate about the work, just like Roy and I are passionate about the practice of law. But of course, being the type of attorney I am, you better believe that I've got documentation in place, and we know what's going to happen if one of us wants out. That's not immediately up the road, but we, just because we're married, we're not necessarily going to retire at the same time. So these are discussions that we have to have as business partners. And also we have to have that discussion of what happens when one of us passes away, because we don't have the same practices. I am not a bankruptcy attorney. And this is not uncommon. There's a lot of partnerships and other businesses where one person does not do all of the jobs and cannot necessarily replace the other partner if they were to meet an unexpected end. So you need to think about all the horrible stuff. It really is like estate planning. Your business planning is estate planning for your business. That's what it is, pure and simple. It's about protection. It's about trying to tie up all the loose ends, looking down the road and figuring, how does this play out until everything is done, every stick of furniture is sold, the sign is off the door, and we've ridden off into the sunset, or we're, met a less happy end. It's all got to be planned for. And again, we have seen time and time again where these formalities were not taken seriously or weren't thought about, and things ended really badly. We've seen businesses close because of these. So, Roy?
Well, yeah, I think it kind of goes back to the whole thing of, routine maintenance. I think we haven't really, I think we've underscored that enough, but that's why it's important to look at, are your records up to date? Are you even maintaining records? Are you maintaining records with copies off-site? Do you have them in the cloud? If I've had a nickel for every time I've had people have a flood, and when I needed records, I say, okay, I need your books and records for the last 3 years. They say, well, my basement flooded, so I have no way of memorializing, but I have it all up in my head. Well, that's very helpful. We'll extract some gray matter and get to the bottom of it. So it's important to not only do you're keeping your records up to date, but you have some type of a disaster plan in place where these records are maintained off-site. So if you do have a problem, you have access to them. For instance, like many law firms, we use Clio, which is a great database in the cloud, 256-bit encryption, and it allows us to maintain records. So if we had some type of Katrina event, we could still pull our records off the cloud and still have it. So that's important to not only keep your records, but don't assume if you keep your records in your basement, your basement's not going to flood, or that your place is not going to get broken into. Or my favorite, somebody had a shredding company come over to his business to do the shredding, and the person who went back and pointed at the boxes to be taken by the Terre Haute company in shreds pointed to his personal books and records. And first of all, I would never have kept him that close to shredding, but he did, and that's a lifestyle choice. And so he lost several years worth of records. So that's a big part of not just maintaining records, but having a plan to store them, to protect them in that off chance something happens, like you get audited, because small businesses tend to get audited more than big businesses. And that just happens. So it's good to be ready for that audit. And if it does happen, to be ready to spring into action with books and records showing every simple thing. In fact, another thing too is, do people scan your receipts? Because you know as well as I do, I'm sure all you listening, that receipts fade. Those gas station receipts that get printed out at the pump, they're worthless in 3 years because they fade. So do you have a procedure for scanning in and retaining digital copies of all these documents so that later on you could actually prove some of your expenses? So it's important to be able to do that. The other thing too is, filing and paying your taxes on time. And if you're in a situation where you cannot pay your taxes on time, for God's sake, file your taxes on time. And I've had so many people that will tell me that, well, I didn't have the money, so I didn't file it. Who cares? File your taxes for a couple reasons. One is it prevents being assessed many penalties that are really harsh, such as the failure to file on time penalty, which is harsh, but also it starts the 3-year window for the government to audit you. And if you don't file your tax returns, that 3-year window that shot clock doesn't start. So it behooves you to, if you don't have the money, to file the tax return and then work out an installment agreement. And a good rule of thumb is, for about every $10,000 of taxes you owe, the government wants you to pay about $150 a month. That's a good one.
That's not that much.
It really isn't. It really isn't. So you could do that. And sometimes they get a little more aggressive, because if you owe $50,000 or more, they're going to want you to fill out some of these onerous 433 forms where they look like bankruptcy schedules, where you list every single asset down to the gold in your teeth. And based on that, they may want you more from you, because if they see you have a retirement account, that's fair game. They're a super creditor. So you don't mess with super creditors. You don't pull on Superman's cape. So some of those situations, they can seize that, but it's really important to file those taxes on time and to stay in the system. And another thing is this: you can discharge income taxes in bankruptcy, but you have to jump through some hoops. And the first hoop is, did you file your taxes on time? And right now, most of the federal appellate courts are taking the position that if you do not file a timely tax return, those taxes are never discharged in bankruptcy. So what that means is you have to wait out the 10-year period of collection or set up a repayment plan with them. Because if you file a timely tax return and you do not do anything goofy, you do not do an offer and compromise, you don't do due process hearings, you just struggle along, those taxes will become uncollectible in 10 years. And sometimes that's the best thing going for a lot of taxpayers. So that was important. So have you noticed that people just haven't gone for years and filed tax returns?
Not in my end of the business.
What happens too is, the first year you don't file tax returns and the men in black do not show up and they don't give you a tune-up in your office. So you feel, okay, cool. Let's see what happens the next year, and then the next year. And then before you know it, you have 7 years of not filing tax returns. And something to remember is that is a crime. Now, after 9/11,
Everybody's heard of Willie Nelson.
oh, well, Wesley Snipes,
Yeah.
he got arguably bad tax advice, even worse than Willie Nelson. I really would not hire Wesley Snipes CPA if given the opportunity.
And aside from tax filings, though, because I mean, I think everybody knows you should file your taxes, but sometimes people forget how big of a deal it is. But there's also when you have a business entity, you're not just a sole proprietor. You do have Secretary of State filings to make with the state of Illinois or whatever state you're incorporated in. And even if you are technically incorporated in another state, you still got to keep up with foreign entity filings with Illinois Secretary of State, and they can dissolve your business involuntarily if you don't keep up with those filings.
Yeah.
They're not difficult. They're usually simple forms to fill out, and they're usually small fees to pay. Sometimes it's $50 here or $100 or a couple hundred there.
And you can file them online too. This isn't something like the old days where you had to use black ink, you had to send in duplicate, so.
So I think, if you're going to have a business checkup, you need to make sure that there is a dedicated person taking care of all of this. And if you are one of those entrepreneurs who loves what you do but doesn't love the taking care of the books part, you need to hire somebody to do that. Because you don't want to have to stop doing what you love doing. I haven't seen any questions come up, Norma, and I haven't heard you interrupt us. So I guess we're going along okay, right?
Doing fine.
Okay. The next section of the outline we made ourselves is Big Trouble in Little Egypt. And this takes us really over more to Roy's side of the practice, because we know that while there are plenty of people who are doing fine, maybe not as well as they were before COVID, they're making it through. We're in that group. We're charging ahead, and we know a lot of people are, but we got to stay open. We were considered essential. That was lucky. Not everybody was. So if you or someone is having financial difficulties in their business, this is again Roy's part of the practice.
Yeah.
So I'll hand that over to him.
Yeah, and that was so bizarre because never in my life had I ever heard the words Roy and essential used in the same sentence. So that was kind of shocking. That was probably the only high point for me of 2020. But the question is, a lot of times businesses have these difficulties, and is it really a bankruptcy situation? And a lot of times it's not. For me, a bankruptcy situation is when somebody says, I have a business that's really no longer a business. It's a really crappy hobby. And in those cases, you've got a couple options. Chapter 7 is a liquidation where somebody can close the business and wind down the business. There are also times when a reorganization may make sense, where somebody says, I had a really rough year, but aside from that, the business fundamentals are in place. So that if I can just somehow get past this last year, I am profitable. In those cases, a reorganization where somebody can go and restructure their debts to stay in business would make sense. And I don't want to really go too much into this. Understand you've got two different flavors. Liquidation, you're done. And reorganization, you're not done yet. Because I experienced probably a painful 4-hour chamber talk on just bankruptcy, and I'm not going to put anybody through that. But the other question is it really a bankruptcy issue? Is this more of an income problem than a debt problem? And I think that's really what we're looking at now, is a lot of people that had more of an income problem because they've been forced to be closed over this time, so they haven't had an income. So then the question becomes, are there things you can do on the expense side to make it a little bit easier? If you're a restaurant, do you have too many things on your menu? Could you just pare down to the 10 things? Or do you have too much staffing? Or do you really need to be open the hours you are open? Could you trim that down? Because one of the things I've seen in COVID is people are becoming more accepting that we're no longer in a 24/7 world. And people are finding now that it's okay that a business closes at 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock, that we don't have to have everything open 24/7. And we don't need to have 20 varieties of yogurt on the shelf 24/7. So that's one thing is, are there things you can deselect, even shipping options, to make it more cost effective for you? But one of the other alternatives to bankruptcy is, can you make offers to clean up your collectibles right off the bat? And I learned this from a guy who worked in the S&L crisis. And he came in and cleaned up a couple of the local banks years ago. And one of the things he would do is go to a failing business, because as bankers know, they can pretty much predict failure, and come in and say, you give me whatever's in your register and we'll forgive the debt. We're done. So if you have somebody who owes you some money, maybe making them an offer of saying, look, if you pay half of that bill in 30 days, I'll forgive the rest. Maybe a good option.
I think anyone in business knows you have at least those couple or handful of clients who aren't paying you. And a lot of times you know what's going on. You know that they're having a hard time. You know that they may have gone through a divorce, whatever the situation is. And the longer it goes on, they ignore it. If you ignore it, before you know it, you're sitting there and they owe you a bill that's got a lot of age on it. And it's not a matter of, they could have been making payments to you the whole time, but that first month they don't pay. It's like that first year you don't file your tax return. Nothing bad happens. You go on. What we recommend to clients often is, look at your collectibles. Are there people there who would pay you, that you've got an offer for, that you can make an offer to? Because while it would be nice to collect the full $5,000 in a time like this, I think it would be great to be able to collect $2,500 or 60% of it, whatever your pain tolerance is. It's kind of time to start looking back in those old records and saying, hey, we're not in a time where nobody has any money. There are people who want to settle things up and want to avoid bankruptcy. They may have slowed down enough to take their head out of the sand and say, I've got to stop ignoring these problems. And somebody sent us a comment on a chat. I'll pull this up for Roy here. Question is about the board meetings and the documentation. Is there a minimum required number of board meetings annually for an LLC? And if not, would you have a recommendation based on revenue, transactions, volume per year, or another criteria? And is there a best practice of recording you would recommend? I'm going to start from the bottom on that one. You want to have a corporate record book, and that is a paper book, and you want to keep it somewhere safe but accessible so that it can be taken out and updated as you need. But you want to also have all of those documents stored electronically. So in my case, we print them out, we sign them, we scan them in. That's the same thing I do for clients. So there is a formal book that we can pull off a shelf and or out of a fireproof safe or something. And there's also a digital copy. Because these aren't, we're not talking about wills or anything of that nature. My position and my understanding of the law is that an electronic signature or a photocopy is fine to show that there was a memorialization. So if the original documents are lost, if that corporate book is stolen, accidentally shredded, lost in a fire, you're okay as long as you have the digital copies. But you want a system in place that says, when we do something, we type this up, the right people sign it, it gets scanned in, the original gets put in the book. It's not that difficult of a process. Now, sometimes you're doing things that will require an additional filing with the Secretary of State, issuance of new stock certificates, surrendering of old stock certificates, promissory notes, different things like that. So there may be more than one document. You may have a whole stack of documents. But an LLC doesn't necessarily have to meet any particular number of times, but I always recommend that you should have an annual meeting in your business.
Actually, I think that's Illinois. I think Illinois really expects you to have an annual meeting. And sometimes you can waive those annual meetings by unanimous consent. My thought would be for directors at a minimum, you want to do quarterly, just to play it safe. Playing it safe, that shows a certain amount of formalities. You can always call special meetings when need be. But I think if you show that you have previously scheduled quarterly meetings, it shows a certain amount of intent and to keeping the formalities. And I think it speaks volumes.
And you ultimately want to show that you're taking the business seriously.
Yeah.
In our case, like a lot of folks, we have a family business. This is us. I've seen families with family businesses use the corporate meeting they basically make it a retreat. It becomes a family reunion. So you kill a few birds with one stone there, and that can work well. But again, I think at bare minimum, you've got to have an annual meeting. But there's going to be things that happen throughout the year that you really should be memorializing as they happen.
Yeah.
Roy's idea of having a quarterly meeting is not bad at all. However, I'm comfortable with an annual meeting. I think it's a matter of, it's probably to some extent a matter of what kind of business you have. But again, the point is that you want to have a record that shows that you are treating the business like a business and taking it seriously and discussing the business, and you're not just flying by the seat of your pants. And I hope that answers the question. If not, let me know. Another thing that Roy deals with often is when the business is a creditor in a bankruptcy or suing somebody to collect. So it's not just about trying to find your, I guess I'll call it your low-lying fruit, and going through your receivables and saying, hey, you know what? I bet I know that Joe Schmo had that divorce, but I think he's coming out of it. I bet if I offered him 50 cents on the dollar, he'd pay me. And again, a bird in the hand, two in the bush.
Yeah.
There you go. So, but sometimes Roy is contacted by businesses who are creditors, and I thought he should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Because we're going to see an uptick in bankruptcies here. We're already seeing it.
Yeah.
So everybody be warned.
I'm already seeing it. And I think the most important rule is if you receive a notice of bankruptcy in a case, stop whatever you're doing. There's something called the automatic stay in bankruptcy that is an injunction. It just stops you from collecting. It stops you from doing really anything. And it's important to respect that so you do not be held in contempt of court, down federal court, very humorless judges in federal court. So you want to stop that. And the other thing too is you probably want to talk to, depending on what the claim is. I mean, if it's a claim for $50, don't waste your time. But if you have a substantial claim, it wouldn't hurt to talk to a bankruptcy attorney to see what are your rights. For instance, do you need to file a claim with the bankruptcy court to possibly share in some of the money if there's any distributed? Is the debtor trying to avoid a lien on collateral? Is there anything going on that could have an adverse impact on you? So it's important to first stop, do not do anything, find a professional, and then find out what your options are. And the other thing too is the bankruptcy court system moves incredibly fast. It really does. The deadline to file a claim is 70 days. That has been shortened down from about 125 days.
And that's fast in the legal world.
Yeah, it's incredibly fast. So something could be sitting on your desk, then it sits on somebody else's desk and somebody else's desk, and you might be out of time. Also, the deadline to object to a motion avoiding a lien you might have on collateral is 21 days to object.
And this is really important because sometimes I think creditors get notice of bankruptcy and they're like, well, they filed bankruptcy, I can't get my money. When in fact, as we mentioned, there are certain debts that aren't dischargeable. The IRS is not the only thing that isn't necessarily dischargeable. It can depend on fraud. Roy's dealt with that many times. So if even if the debtor hasn't defrauded you in some way, if they've committed fraud and other aspects, they could be denied a discharge altogether and still owe all their creditors the money forever.
Also, there's a fun legal term. Anybody who sells stuff owes it to themselves to Google the word reclamation. you have certain rights under the Uniform Commercial Code to get your stuff back if you shipped it within a certain amount of time of the filing of the bankruptcy. So there's a lot of rights, especially for people that sell goods. And it just amazes me how few people know their rights. So
yeah, and the big takeaway, I know we're running out of time, Norma. Creditors have rights too. There are
Yes.
debtors' rights, there are creditors' rights. Everybody has rights. Companies have rights technically as creditors or debtors. And since we're starting to run out of time, I just wanted to make one last comment as an estate planning attorney that again, since things are slowing down, well, in the midst of all of this, you better believe I updated my estate plan. It was a great time to do it. And it was a great time when other things came up and I said, oh gosh, what if something happens? Time to update it. So if you don't have an estate plan or you don't have it updated, now's the time to do it for yourself, not just for your business. Because if we're talking about your business, you've got to take care of yourself. The caregiver has to take care of themselves. So I guess that's all I got to say about that.
well, no, and also, and I don't want to sound hippy dippy, but self-care. That's really the
Yeah.
key.
Yeah.
You've really got to take care of yourself. This has been a very traumatic time.
So we got through our outline, which I didn't know that we were going to be able to do. But again, it's a fairly broad overview, but I think the important thing was to point out how many things there are to consider, not just during COVID, but using this as a good wake-up call and a good slower time to not just think about it, but to actually get it done. So Norma, I'll end with that.
Okay, thank you guys. It was very interesting. I think that you answered questions as we went along. Lots of great information, lots of things to think about. We do all need to think in this time about protecting what we have, as well as helping others protect what they have. And I think you've done a good job of giving us some food for thought on what that looks like for us. So I want to thank Kay and Roy for that information. We've posted their address or their phone number and their address and their emails on the slide if you're looking at the slideshow, so you have access to how to reach them if you want to talk more with them. I want to thank Bauer Funeral Home for being our webinar sponsor today. You have their phone number and website address on the slide as well. And this webinar has been recorded. It will be available tomorrow. It'll be in our weekly business advocate that comes out on Friday mornings. And then it's also on our Effingham Chamber YouTube channel. So the webinars are all posted there. So if there's something you want to go back and listen to again, something that was said today that you want to kind of look back and listen to again, you can do that. You'll be receiving an evaluation form, and we ask you to please fill that out and return it to us. That really helps us a lot. Learning about other topics that you want to hear about, learning about how to run the webinars maybe a little more efficiently. So please take your time, take time to do that. Next week's webinar on Thursday, June 25th will be at 9 a.m. and the topic's going to be unemployment insurance, and that's another big part of the whole COVID-19 situation that we've been for the last couple of months. We've got people, millions of people are on unemployment. As an employer, you need to know what that means to you as an employer. It's great that our employees are able to draw on those funds. The federal government's been very generous with that. But the Illinois Unemployment Insurance Act was amended to address COVID issues. Next week, our speaker is Scott Cruz. He is a labor and employment attorney at Greensfelder, Kempker and Gale, and he will highlight the changes in the unemployment insurance law, how employers are impacted, and strategies employers should use to comply and protect their operations from unemployment-related claims during COVID-19. So I'm really looking forward to Scott's presentation. He works a lot with the Illinois Chamber, so we were able to capture him to do this webinar for our members. It's a huge topic. Hopefully you'll go listen in and learn about how unemployment insurance is affecting you as an employer and your employees. So you'll learn more about that in the days to come. So at this point in time, I'm signing off. Thank you for joining us today again for the weekly webinar series of the Effingham County Chamber of Commerce. And hope you have a wonderful weekend.